Our second scripture this morning is from the Gospel according to Matthew. If you are able, would you please stand for the reading of the Gospel? Matthew chapter 10. This is Jesus speaking. Do not think I have come to bring peace to earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Their number was finally complete, the 12, who would become known later in history as the apostles of Jesus. Matthew, the tax collector, was the last one called, a sure sign to the rest of them that Jesus was more strange than he was familiar. They were a mixed band of misfits already, a zealot, violently opposed to the Romans, called to be a brother to a tax collector, one who had collaborated with the Romans. They were fishermen with calloused hands and the weight of family expectations on their shoulders. They were faithful and they were not learned Jews. And the opinions about how the Messiah should or shouldn't be that they had were as varied as they were. But now they were 12. 12 apostles for 12 tribes of Israel, but it seemed that even Jesus didn't think that was going to be enough. Once Jesus had seen the crowds and had compassion on them because he knew they were with sheep without a shepherd, that they were harassed and helpless, and he had turned to his disciples and said, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers, they are few." These precious, seemingly unqualified, desperate few would be trusted with so much, maybe too much. Once Jesus summoned his 12 disciples, and before he sent them out, he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, to cure every disease and every sickness. He told them, "As you go, proclaim the good news that the kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons." And truth be told, this is what they longed for. This is what Israel had hoped for in those eternal generations of loss and waiting for justice. This is what men young and old and women young and old had dreamed of, that God would one day show up in power and share that power with them. And maybe if Jesus had stopped there, with this litany of their abilities, with this recounting of all the power available to them, these 12 might have gotten full of themselves and might have become like all the other disciples of all the other would-be messiahs that had tried and failed and died. But that was never Jesus' way. He never sought to soothe the ones with power already, to give to those who already had much. "See, I am sending you out," he said once to them. "I am sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. So you will need to be wise as serpents, though innocent as doves. And beware, because where I am sending you, they will hand you over to councils and flog you in the synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me. As a testimony to them and the Gentiles, you will be hated because of my name, but the one who endures amongst you, they will be saved." And maybe even these warnings weren't unexpected. The 12 had already seen what Jesus could do and how people in power already hated him for it. Even persecution can be borne, can be endured if you believe that the coming kingdom is going to be one where there's destruction for your enemies, like Rome. They could endure being rejected by strangers. They could endure even being rejected by their own people who were still unready for what God was going to do in Jesus. But could they endure the loss of their families? The rejection of the ones they needed the most? Did James and John, who are called brothers of thunder in Scripture, did they look at one another in fear when Jesus said, "I have come to set a man against his father"? Because James and John abandoned their father and his business to follow Jesus. Did Mary Magdalene or Susanna or Joanna take startled breaths when Jesus warned, "I have come to set a daughter against her mother and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law"? Joanna's mother-in-law was, she was in the family of Herod. Did Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector look at each other apprehensively when Jesus said, "I have come so that one of your foes will become a member of your own household"? How do a collaborator and a zealot share a room? Did Peter reflexively close his eyes and wince when Jesus said, "Whoever loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me"? They could accept that Jesus came as a sword against their enemies. But how could he be the sharp edge that cut them off from the people that grounded who they were? Maybe Jesus appeared cruel in that moment to them, but I imagine he is grieved when he tells them about the coming costs, because they are costs he has already borne himself. He loved these people. He loved his disciples. He loved his apostles. And who wants their beloved friends who have become their family to be hurt, to be persecuted, to be rejected, to be chased out of town, to be brought on unjust trial, to be cut off from the families they loved? But Jesus doesn't lie. And even though his knowledge isn't total, like the knowledge that God the Father has, Jesus knows enough to tell the truth to them. They had all grown up in the same world, where the haves and the have-nots did not mingle with each other, where loyalty to family trumped everything, where you risked everything by associating with the wrong kinds of people. Your family was your nursing home and 401k and job security. They all grew up in the same place where crossing social lines meant you had to pay a heavy price, like ostracization or death. And following Jesus, belonging to each other instead of to their families, that was the crossed line. That was the forbidden mingling. That was the stamp of judgment eternal being seen with the wrong people, like prostitutes and tax collectors. Jesus had to know. And they had to know. Everybody had to be honest. Before they could be sent out, they needed to know that they were all walking the fine edge of a sword about to be swung. Those who find their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Did they believe him? Do we? I never feel farther away from Jesus than when I read this scripture. You and I live in a world Jesus could not have imagined, where people who claim to follow him make up a majority of our country rather than the minority. Our government is dominated by men and women who claim to be Christians. Whether that is true or not, I will leave up to Jesus. Enshrined in our national legal documents are laws that provide me the freedom to worship how I please within reason. I have never risked anything to claim to follow Jesus. My decision to become a vocational minister did not cost me friends or family, and did not cost my friends or family anything. Sometimes it feels like this scripture has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with us. And then I remember the stories. New Heart Community Church in La Mirada, California voted in May of 2014 to become what's called a Third Way Church, a congregation where members agreed to disagree about the issues of LGBTQ inclusion, to not judge each other or split the church. This came after their pastor, Danny Cortez, shared with this church that after years and years and years of prayer and scripture reading and theological reflection, he had to affirm and bless his gay son. For this act, New Heart and Pastor Cortez were disfellowshipped from the Southern Baptist Convention. I remember Reverend Adam Phillips, who was a clergy person in the Evangelical Covenant Church, and he was planting a church in Portland, Oregon, but when he and his church expressed the openness to welcoming LGBTQ people to their church, when they dared to be the inclusive community that they saw Jesus being, the Evangelical Covenant Church withdrew their funding and abandoned Phillips and his congregation. As an aside, Christ Church Portland is still open and is now a disciples' church. I remember Reverend Ken Wilson of the Vineyard Church in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who after years of scriptural discernment and theological reflection and deep prayer wrote a letter to my congregation, a book outlining why he had moved from a traditional position to an affirming position on LGBTQ people, and in the aftermath, hundreds of people left his church, and his denomination published a new standard forbidding full membership to LGBTQ people. And rather than have one of his staff members, who is a married lesbian, go with no job, she and him started a new church called Blue Ocean. I think of my friend, Reverend Kendall Rothis, whose congregation, Lakeshore Baptist Church in Waco, Texas, was recently ejected from the Baptist General Convention of Texas, along with First Baptist Church in Austin, because those congregations took action to become LGBTQ welcoming after years of careful discernment around scripture and prayer. They all listened to Jesus and to the scriptures, and they sought after God's will in prayer, and they took time to talk and discern together as a community, and they all knew the risks of being faithful to Jesus in this way. That when they crossed the uncrossable line, that they would lose their denominations, that they would lose many of their congregation members, that they might lose family members. And in the case of Kendall's church, the students who attend there, who attend Truett Seminary, who receive their scholarships only because they go to BGCT churches, will no longer have those scholarships. And yet, they still chose this hard route of being obedient to God, even if it cut them off from the places they had depended upon. Perhaps, if anything, this scripture is a warning to me, to us, that we may have grown too used to the ease of being Christian in this place. or maybe the ease of being Christian as long as we don't push back against any of the edges we see as sinful. But you don't have to look too far back to see Jesus' teaching coming true, the fruit of being unfaithful, damaging us. Christians who dared to advocate for civil rights were mocked and vilified, and many ministers lost their jobs. Christians who dared to speak out against the evils of slavery were jailed, were ostracized, and were vilified by the government. Christians who dared to reject anti-Semitism and the racism of the white supremacy movement here in America were accused of being race traitors. But notice the unifying theme of all of these moments in time. Whenever Christians stand with marginalized people, the ostracized, the least of these, in a world they experience exactly what Jesus promised. When Christians transgress over class lines, when they transgress over racial lines, when they transgress over social and cultural lines to share the love and abundance of God, they experience the sharp edge of the sword that Jesus promised that cuts off you from those you love. And there are still lines to cross and transgress in our world. Whether you are affirming and celebrating LGBTQ persons as fully made in the image of God and worthy of love, or you are advocating and honoring the full humanity of immigrants, whether they are documented or undocumented, or you are reaching out to any other group who live on the margins of the culture, you are choosing Jesus. And you are crossing a line that may cut you off from people you love. You are crossing out of the old country where all the isms defined you. And you're crossing into God's country where you are defined by God's abundant and beautiful love. But make no mistake, the border crossing is not easy. Just because Jesus will be with you doesn't make it less painful. But when we follow Jesus, we are guided by this belief that those who lose their lives for his sake will actually find them. So even though this scripture feels far away, this is my prayer for us. That if in the future we sense God is calling us to cross borders, to transgress expectations, to love people that the world says we should not, my prayer is that we would do so anyway. My prayer is that if following God has the potential to set us against friends and family, even against country, that our friends and family and country would one day be moved by our faithfulness and would leave behind what separates us in order to join us in service to God. My prayer is that we would rejoice in the promise of Jesus that one day our enemies will become members of our family. And until then, I pray that God would make our hearts able to be faithful at all.